Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our final virtual lecture of 2021. And we are super excited to be co-hosting this one with Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, our research partners at Haynie Pueblo Archaeological Preserve in Southern Colorado. And just before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know we will be doing a short Q&A at the end. So if you have questions as the presentation goes along, drop them in the Q&A on Zoom or in the comments on Facebook, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So I would like to welcome our first presenter, Jim Walker, Southwestern Regional Director. He's going to tell you just a little bit more about the Conservancy's role in acquiring and preserving Haynie Pueblo. Jim?
Hello, how are you? As April said, I'm Jim Walker, Southwest Regional Director for the Archaeological Conservancy. And I know that some of you are Conservancy members, some of you are members of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, some of you are members of La Plata County Open Space, and some of you are History Colorado members. And I'll bet there are a few people out there that belong to all of those organizations. So we are here to tell you a little bit about a joint project that we're doing with Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. It revolves around Haynie Pueblo. And I'm very happy to announce that one of the reasons we're doing this lecture tonight is that we have been awarded jointly, Crow Canyon and the Conservancy, as the 2021 Stephen H. Hart Award for Archaeology recipients. And we haven't got the award yet, but the award will be actually presented in person at the 36th Annual Hart Awards, which are going to be held in Denver on Monday, February 7th at 5 o'clock at the History Colorado Center. And to learn more about this, you can look at historycolorado.org. Actually, we are no strangers to History Colorado Awards. This will be our second award for the Conservancy. We got a State Archaeologist Award in 2012 and also the Stephen H. Hart Award 2021. Crow Canyon, actually, this is their third award from History Colorado. They got an award in 1997, another one in 2003, and the Stephen Hart Award in 2021 will be their third. And so we couldn't have done it without you. This year, the History Colorado decided to do this as a People's Choice Award. And so there were more than 1,600 votes cast for 5 projects. And the people chose Haynie Pueblo. Actually, we got 48% of the votes. And so I know that a lot of you voted, and that may be why you're here. So I'd like to thank you for your support. So what we're going to do is I have a taped presentation about Haynie Pueblo that talks a little bit about the role that the Archaeological Conservancy played. And is that presentation queued up?
I'll get it ready right now, Jim.
Okay, that sounds good. So what we're going to do is have this presentation, and then we will go on to Kellam Throgmorton, who will introduce his presentation. And I'm going to be talking about the acquisition aspects of the project. Kellam is going to be talking about the archaeology. And so sit back and relax and enjoy the show. Hello, I'm Jim Walker, Southwest Regional Director for the Archaeological Conservancy, a national nonprofit preservation organization headquartered in Albuquerque. We are honored to have been chosen, together with our preservation partners, Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, as History Colorado's
2021 Stephen A. Hart Award recipients for our collaborative efforts to preserve Haynie Pueblo in Montezuma County. Over the past 39 years, the Conservancy has established 21 archaeological preserves in Colorado with the assistance of 8 Colorado Historical Fund grants. Permanently preserving Haynie Pueblo ensures that scholars, school children, Native Americans, and all of us can study and enjoy this national treasure. I'm here to talk a little bit about the acquisition. And the second title for this talk could be How a Reverse Mortgage Can Go Wrong. The Archaeological Conservancy began discussions with the owners of Haynie Pueblo about acquiring the site in 1982 when we first started looking at potential sites for acquisition in the Cortez area. The couple had owned the site since the mid-1960s, and in the early 1980s, they were just beginning to dig on the 5-acre tract. The couple were looking for pots, and they were not really interested in selling the property to the Conservancy for preservation. To settle debts, the owner obtained a reverse mortgage on the 5 acres in a modular home in the 1990s. But instead of taking a lifetime of monthly payments, the owner took a lump sum disbursement from the mortgage company at closing. The owner passed away in 2014, leaving the modular home and 5 acres to his girlfriend in his will. I met with the girlfriend in the summer of 2015 to discuss a possible acquisition. She told me that the mortgage company had been demanding that the loan be paid off and had threatened to repossess her property. After examining the demand letters, I realized that the amount now owed to the mortgage company in principal and accrued interest exceeded the market value of the property. Since the Conservancy has a strict board policy not to pay more than market value for acquisition, as determined by appraisal, I had to walk away from the negotiations. After doing a market analysis, I knew that I wouldn't be able to get an appraisal that matched the amount due. The mortgage company began foreclosure proceedings on the property, and following Colorado law, a foreclosure auction was conducted on the courthouse steps in Cortez, where only one bid was received, a bid from the mortgage company for the amount owed. The mortgage company then cleaned up the property. The lot was strewn with rusting car parts and motors. The owner was a shade tree mechanic. They then listed the property with a local realtor. The property was then purchased by a group of 3 preservation-minded investors who were friends of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in 2016. Since the acquisition by the investors in 2016 was an arm's length open market transaction, I realized the transaction created a new comparable for the property that could be acknowledged as fair market value by an appraiser. The best comparable for a property is what it sold for last. The property had also appreciated in value since being repossessed. A new appraisal ordered by the Conservancy in 2018 confirmed that theory. In 2018, the Conservancy entered into a purchase option agreement with the 3 investors who owned the property. The Conservancy then applied for and was awarded a Colorado Historical Fund acquisition grant to buy the Haynie site in 2019. Our 8th acquisition matching grant from Colorado Historical Fund since 1997. We acquired the property in 2019, our 17th preserve in the Montezuma Valley. Another aspect of the Colorado Historical Fund project involves a preservation easement that will be placed on the property to protect the investment the state of Colorado has made in the permanent preservation of Haynie Pueblo. The easement will be held by La Plata Open Space Conservancy in Durango. The easement terms restrict the use of the land by prohibiting grazing and development. Annual monitoring of the property's condition will then be performed by the easement holder. And a management plan has been developed for the site. The project also includes new fencing along the front of the lot and the installation of new no trespassing signs. To better inform the public about the site's significance, a poster and handout describing the site has been developed by Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Guided tours of the site will be available for interested school groups and individuals upon request. The initiation of the tour program has been delayed due to the pandemic. The Conservancy realizes that preservation awards help communities understand the importance of saving the past, and that through preservation, the knowledge and wonders of the past can be appreciated and shared for generations to come. Thank you for helping to make this preservation effort a success.
All right. Thank you for listening to our little presentation. And now I would like to introduce Kellam Throgmorton with Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, who's going to talk about the archaeology at Haynie Pueblo. Kellam.
Hey, greetings. Thank you for the introduction, Jim. And I also just wanted to say, as an archaeologist and a citizen, thank you for your work in making this property acquisition possible over the last roughly decade or more that you've been putting in the time and the effort. It's important stuff, so thanks very much. Now, as Jim said, I'm Kellam Throgmorton. I am the field director at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. I've been working with Crow Canyon for about 2.5 years. I came onto the project at the Haynie Site in 2019 after finishing up my PhD at Binghamton University in upstate New York. What I'm going to be talking about this evening is just giving an overview of the work that we've been doing out at the site since about 2016, trying to highlight a few of the more interesting things that we've uncovered, think a little bit about how it fits into the broader context of the archaeology of the region, and also particularly with reference to the archaeology of the Chacoan world, because of course, some of the major interest in the Haynie site was the fact that it had these Chacoan greathouses on it. But there's a lot more to it than that, as I'm going to get into in a moment here. So I'm going to work on getting my screen share going. Let's make sure that this works. Are you ready for that, April?
I'm ready.
And share sound, optimize. All right. Is that going on out there to everybody?
We can see it.
Awesome. Well, and just a note, if you haven't used Zoom before, I am probably appearing as a little talking head somewhere in the right-hand side of the screen. You can actually change how big that box is. You can move it around. So if it happens to be in the way of something that you'd like to see on one of these slides, you ought to be able to move that without too much of an issue. So here we've got an aerial photo of the Haynie site. This is the property in Montezuma County in southwest Colorado. you can see that there's a couple of contemporary buildings on it. That's one of the first things you would notice as you would come onto the site is there's a house on it, there's a shed on it, there is a big metal machine shop and garage on it. There have been a lot of historic and recent impacts to the site. And in fact, as we began the project, that was one of the things that we first encountered was, hang on, just want to make sure my screen's moving forward. As Crow Canyon began the project, one of the first things was trying to get a handle on sort of the extent of the site. Where are the deposits intact and not intact? And in fact, there were cars and pieces of scrap metal and such spread across much of the property. So our initial assessment began with what we call drone photogrammetry. We flew a drone over the site, and it helped us develop a three-dimensional model of the site that lets us know the elevations of things, see where the potholes are from earlier excavation projects, non-professional work. It also gave us a good sense of the topography and the lay of the land to help identify where there might be room blocks and buried structures. Mapping was a part of that, laying out a grid across the site so that we'd know where we were at any given moment. Crow Canyon also did an analysis of surface ceramics. So this is by going around and actually recording every potsherd that occurs within a small area. You'll take a little, what we'd call a dog leash unit, and look at all the pottery within a 2 by 2 meter, that's about 6 by 6 foot little square. It actually can help tell us where, oh, the early part of the site is over here, the late part of the site is over here. We also conducted remote sensing, which is a term that refers to a suite of techniques. Electrical resistivity has proven to be one of the most effective at the Haynie site. Magnetometer survey is also a popular method of remote sensing, but because of all of the car parts and spark plugs and pieces of metal and broken glass and wires, the magnetometer work doesn't turn out quite as well because it picks up every little tiny piece of metal and it obscures any of the archaeological remains underneath. We also conducted some stabilization, just taking a look at some of the standing walls at the site and going, what do we need to do to make sure that this doesn't tumble down on any of the guests to the site, any of the participants who've come to work with Crow Canyon. So on this slide, you can see a little bit of here's how we laid out the grid. Here's the remote sensing. Here is a 3D model that was actually developed by Paleo West Archaeology through a partnership with Crow Canyon. And that way we could just as a sort of baseline for here is what different buildings on the site looked like. To get you oriented, here's just a little video clip of the western third of the site. This is where Crow Canyon's excavations and other investigations have been focused since 2016. And it gives you a sense of what the lay of the land is, the kinds of things you see and hear on an archaeological site. This was filmed this year while we had our college field school out there. You can see some shade shelters. You can also see tarps covering units that we're not currently working on. And it also gives you a sense that the Haynie site is up on a little bit of a hill, a little bit of a ridge. And you can see those agricultural fields that surround the site, which of course is one of the reasons that ancestral Pueblo people were living at the place 1,000 years ago. So how does Crow Canyon do our work? How do we do our research? Well, we get a Colorado state permit. We work with the state of Colorado and receive permission to conduct excavations. And through that, we develop a research design that says, here's where we're going to look, here is what we're looking for, here is why we would excavate under particular circumstances. Here are the methods we're going to use. Here are the places that the artifacts are going to go after the excavations are complete. These are all things that professional projects have to keep in mind. And I think it's one of the key things that sets professional archaeology apart from non-professional archaeology. We've got this sort of firm set design for how does the work get done and what do we do with the data, the information, and the artifacts when it's all said and done. Crow Canyon has a native advisory group, and they have, through consultation with us, helped us develop some of the methods that we use in the field and have a role in part of that research design as well. Now, Crow Canyon, a big part of what we do is experiential education and participant archaeology. So that means that we have college field schools, high school field schools, and other school groups that have come from around the state and the country to work with us and learn about the ancestral Pueblo archaeology of Southwest Colorado, and to learn about archaeology and the methods of archaeology in general. We also have an adult research program where people come from around the country to work with us alongside our staff in the field. So on the, you can see some of those participants in these photos here. You can see my colleague Steve Copeland in the photo on the lower left there. And this is how we get the work done. The Haynie site, this has been a big project, and at the moment we really only have 2 permanent staff members who are doing field work, myself and Steve Copeland. We could not get this done without the participants and students and school groups that have come through the Haynie site, and which the Archaeological Conservancy has made possible for us to do as well. So thank you to everyone who's had a role in this. If any of you are on here, I think I saw a few names that I recognized out there folks who've played a role in the work that we're doing and helped with the excavation. So a tip of the hat to you. So I'm going to get into the sort of the details of the archaeology at this point, and to give you a little bit better sense of what are we learning, what are we finding out through the last 5 years that Crow Canyon has been working at the Haynie site. Now, as I said, we've been focusing on the western third of the site, and that's what you can see in this plan map that I have on this slide here. What we've discovered is that in addition to the Chacoan archaeology, that is the 2 masonry greathouses, the 2 large pueblos that are the most prominent aspect of the Haynie site, we have found that it includes a significant pre-Chacoan component as well. It kind of caught us off guard. It was a little bit of a surprise. There are structures and deposits dating from Pueblo I all the way up through early Pueblo III, but with a particular emphasis on these Pueblo I, early Pueblo II, and middle Pueblo II deposits. So this slide right here is showing you where our excavations have uncovered deposits or structures that date to the Pueblo I period. Now, the Pueblo I period in this part of Colorado, that is the moment when ancestral Pueblo folks first moved into aggregated dwellings, big apartment style buildings, or you might have 10 or 12 families living in a single structure. It's a remarkable transition. It happens around the globe. Most cultures have gone through a transition of moving into these large apartment style houses. The Haynie site has proven to be a really excellent place to look at this particular transition. This is a photo of one of the more completely excavated areas that we've been working in on the western third of the Haynie site. And I think it displays that Pueblo I architecture fairly well. As we got this area actually began as a single 1x1 meter excavation unit that happened to land on one of the most complicated portions of the whole thing, where like all these rooms and structures are coming together. And over the course of 5 years, we expanded the excavation area to more fully understand what it was we were looking at. And we think we have identified the southwestern edge of a large room block. And here I'm going to show you, just give you an idea here of what you're looking at. In blue, I'm outlining wall segments and projected wall segments that belong to the Pueblo I period. And so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rooms that we know of that are contiguous to one another, running in a line north-south. Each of these rooms, every pair of these rooms or 3 of these rooms would probably have a larger, what we call a front room. I've dashed those in blue. Those are the habitation spaces. And we have in fact identified a portion of a Pueblo I front room, a habitation room in one of the grid squares that's kind of on the right-hand side of this image. But what made this especially complicated is that a later middle Pueblo II kiva, shown in yellow, cut through the earlier room block. And portions of the surface rooms that went with this middle Pueblo II kiva are also overlying the Pueblo I architecture. So this has been a real a challenge, a fun place to train interns, a great place for field school students to learn how to deal with some very complicated stratigraphy. It's been especially challenging because there's been so many remodels to these structures. So those of you who've been out to the site with me have often heard my analogy of it's kind of like pulling back the carpet in a house and realizing there's a hardwood floor underneath. Well, in some of these rooms, we did that 4 times, where here's a floor, we go below it. Oh, here's another floor from an earlier incarnation of the structure. And each of them is separated by only about 10 or 15 centimeters. That's maybe like 5 inches of sediment. People lived in this structure for over 100 years, the Pueblo I portion of this. It was a very well lived in structure with a lot of changes. And I'm very much looking forward to getting back some of the data from the lab and some of our samples to help us refine some of the dates on this. And it's going to help us understand a lot more about the Pueblo I period at the Haynie site. Another thing that we uncovered from the Pueblo I period is a pit structure. One of our test units, a 2 by 2 meter test unit, by chance happened to fall in the northwestern section of a pit structure. We were not particularly clear on the dates of it, other than that the fill seemed to be Pueblo II in age, some late Pueblo I. I was actually pleasantly surprised that this summer we got back some tree ring dates from this structure, and it put it in the late AD 780s. That was about 100 years earlier. I lost a bet on this one, so this was about 100 years earlier than I'd expected. And this was also a great learning experience because our Crow Canyon's first dendroarchaeology intern, working with Dr. Benjamin Bellarado, was the one who did the analysis of the beams. So you can see the charred beams from this structure in situ in the photo on the lower left. We also uncovered a fragment of what we think is a complex sipapu. In the photo on the upper right, you can see this kind of cross-shaped feature in the lower right-hand portion of the excavation area. Complex sipapus are relatively rare. Pit structures typically have a sipapu. That is a Pueblo feature that in a nutshell is representative of the emergence place into this world. But there's a hierarchy of simple to complicated ones, with the complex ones being relatively rare. And it does give us a suggestion that there are sort of differences between people in these different houses on the site. Not everybody has one of these features. It suggests that the person or family using this pit structure might have had more ritual responsibilities within their community. We also found an open twined mat laying on the floor of this structure that was partially covering the complex sipapu. You can see a picture of it in the middle of the lower tier. And I've given you a photo of a well-preserved one from a cliff dwelling in Arizona, just to give you an idea what it would have looked like. That was a very difficult and challenging feature to excavate. We actually had a specialist, Lori Webster, come and take a look at it in the structure as we excavated it, because we didn't think we could get it out intact. Now, the Pueblo I period, I'm particularly fond of. It's a time period that I've worked with a lot. One thing that I think goes unrecognized about it is just how big the villages are and how big the structures are. So here's the plan map of the whole Haynie site. I'm overlaying a map of a well-documented Pueblo I village at the same scale. So you can see that little area we've been excavating is just a fraction of what could potentially be underneath the rest of the architecture and deposits at the Haynie site. We've really just sort of more than scratched the surface, but we have really only identified a small portion of what might actually be there. Here's another example using McPhee Pueblo, which is a particularly famous and well-known building from this time period, and one which is a good analog for the archaeology we've been working on, because it has early Pueblo I in the 700s all the way up through middle Pueblo II deposits in the 1000s, which, as you're going to see in a moment, really describes what we're encountering at the Haynie site quite well too. So moving on to the early Pueblo II period, this is about 890, we were surprised at the quantity of deposits we've encountered that date to this time period. And that's very exciting, because the early Pueblo II period is not well represented at all in Southwest Colorado and in the Mesa Verde region. Those big villages that I was just talking about in the Pueblo I period, there was a bit of an upheaval. I often call it a political crisis exacerbated by bad climate regimes. In the late 800s, things really fell apart, and a lot of these communities were rapidly depopulated, and the people, the ancestral Pueblo folks living here, went west, south, southeast. But some of them did stay in the region and continued to inhabit villages, and it seems like Haynie is probably one of these. And so we are learning a lot about what is undoubtedly a formative period for a lot of things in Pueblo archaeology in this region, but which we know very little about, just because there's very few sites that have been investigated from this time period. Well, we think we've encountered a room block that probably had its origins in the Pueblo I period, but big portions of it were remodeled throughout the early Pueblo II period. And I've got that highlighted in red up here. There's other places where we've encountered deposits from this period, but this is the main locus where it seems to be occurring. And what we're finding is that these early Pueblo II structures are directly on top of underlying Pueblo I structures. It's a little hard to see in this photo, so I've highlighted. You can see the outline of a cross wall from the Pueblo I building that is directly underneath this, this early Pueblo II structure. And you can see the wall segment for the early Pueblo II building. It's the masonry section in the upper right-hand corner of this, this image. And so there you might be able to get a little bit of a better shot. And it really looks like people returned, well, people lived in the Pueblo I portion of this structure. The structure was perhaps even demolished or taken apart, deconstructed, and the floors of the early Pueblo II structure was laid directly atop the earlier architecture, which is a pattern that occurs at some, not all, but some of the early Pueblo II villages that have been investigated in the Mesa Verde region. So here's a slide. This is a figure from an upcoming publication that I have with Grant Coffey here at Crow Canyon and Dr. Richard Wilshoes, and just highlighting these examples of Pueblo I structures where the early Pueblo II portion is directly on top of it and sometimes duplicates the same floor plan. I think that's an important detail because in most instances, it looks like there is a little bit of a hiatus. Like this earlier Pueblo I structures were allowed to fall into disrepair. And after a period of maybe 30 or so years, people came back and reconstructed the building in almost exactly the same floor plan. I mean, I really do think you can almost imagine some of these cases as Pueblo people who had left this region in the late 800s. They returned 40 years later, grandparents coming back to villages they remembered as kids and saying, here's how we're going to lay it out. And they really do follow the pattern of these earlier villages. That's one interesting fact we've been finding out. The expectation was that in a period of population decline, people would go back to living in single household dwellings. But in a lot of cases, it seems like they're continuing to live in these aggregated villages, not quite at the same scale, but still inhabiting multi-household room blocks. And just to give you a taste of the kind of material culture we see from that period, these are all artifacts from the same room and from the early Pueblo II period room. We've got what we call an exuberant corrugated jar sherd. I jokingly say this is the first indented corrugated jar in Southwest Colorado. That's a transition from plain gray wares to indented gray wares that occurs in the 900s. We've also got a projectile point that's fairly typical of the early Pueblo II into the middle Pueblo II period. We had a wolf mandible, and that's what you're seeing in that middle photo. And our faunal analyst, Jonathan Dombrowski, tells me that it was an enormous old wolf, not a domesticated dog, at the very large size, at the very upper limits of the size range for wolves. So that was, I don't think it's an accident that was placed underneath and between the floors. People often left these kinds of votive deposits. This had meaning for people who put it there. It was not just throwing something unusual out with the trash. And then finally, a Cortez black on white sherd. This is the pottery type that's very indicative of this early Pueblo II period. We also have encountered large stratified deposits dating from this period, almost 1.5 meters of sediment directly overlaying a late Pueblo I use surface. It seems to be just material washing in and blowing in and people tromping through there and depositing artifacts and other materials. I get really excited about this stratigraphic profile. I'm not sure everybody else does, but I was so excited about it that I've actually initiated a micromorphological study where we want to know more about what is going on between these different strata. Can we identify use surfaces that would have been outside of structures that are hiding in here? Or can we learn more about the kinds of just microscopically visible things that are incorporated into these deposits? Here's a photo of Dr. Kirk Anderson giving us a hand with taking the samples. And I think I saw that Dr. Michael Ayuvalasa is on this webinar. So Michael, these things are on their way to Pennsylvania, and I think they'll be on their way to you hopefully in the next couple of weeks. we've gotten radiocarbon results back from some of these deposits, and they are just right down the middle of the early Pueblo II period, 890s through the early 1000s, from top to bottom. Very exciting because we're going to learn a lot about environmental change. We're going to learn a lot about technological change in pottery by looking at the artifacts from the bottom to the top of this well-stratified deposit. Now, moving into the middle Pueblo II period, we've had a fair amount of archaeology from this as well. And some of the work that we were doing this year was really what started tying this period together for us. I felt like I didn't have a good understanding of it until this year. So thank you to the participants who are out there with us. We had a small cadre of folks working in September, and the work that you were all doing is what really helped this kind of cement in my mind. And here you have what we call structure 1047. You're looking at roughly the southwest quarter of a early kiva that was ritually decommissioned. We think it probably dates right around AD 1050. The roof support system uses upright posts, which became increasingly uncommon through the 1000s. There's still examples as late as 1075, 1080. But this structure also is fully masonry lined, below the bench, above the bench, which would suggest that it's a little bit on the late end. So it's kind of combining a roof technique that's becoming out of fashion and a wall technique that is becoming more in fashion. The masonry might also have to do with the fact that this kiva does seem to have had fair number of ritual uses, and the decommissioning of the structure supports that. As you can see, there is a dog burial on the floor that is partially exposed. We also had a probable turkey burial that we only identified a little portion of. And there are clusters and deposits of groundstone with bone awls introduced into those groundstone clusters. There are a number of examples from this early and middle Pueblo II period of these kinds of ritual decommissionings where animals are placed as votive deposits on the floor of the structure as the Pueblo folks using it decided it was no longer going to be used as a kiva and was going to transition into some different use. And just to give you a little bit of an idea here of some of the artifacts, a closer look at things. Here's an axe fragment. This Dagoji style Mancus black on white jar sherd is currently the best way we have to date this structure. Those Dagoji style pottery really becomes common around 1040 AD. And so that's where we started thinking, all right, this pit structure is probably more in the 1040s, 1050s. And it does seem to be a style that spreads in association with things Chacoan. Now, it's not uniquely an identifier of like a Chacoan identity, but it does seem to have had its origins in the central San Juan Basin, where it's a very common stylistic motif for pottery in the 10 and 1100s. And there's an example of the bone awl, a mono, and then finally we had a sandal last. Now these sandal lasts are not used in the creation of sandals, not used to make them. But they're more like a representation of sandals. And as my colleague Ben Bellarado would point out, a lot of the really finely made sandals are not just for walking and everyday use. These are probably things used for ritual in the course of ritual practices that people would have been doing. And this particular sandal last it has a contour toe that suggests that it also dates right around 1040. This style of toe form became common right around then. And so Ben and I were looking at these today and saying, you know, this is good congruence that we've got an early Dagoji style sherd in here. We've got the sandal last in the style that dates right around 1040 as well. I think that helps us put a date on this structure. Now, we did something a little unusual with this. Our spider senses went off and we went, this is a very special place. The things that were placed on the floor of this kiva were meant to be in this position, and they were meant to be part of this kiva. They were meant to close this place down and transition it from whatever use it had been for the Pueblo people and ritual practitioners using it to something else. They'd essentially put it to rest. And the objects in this assemblage are part of that. And so after thinking about it and talking about it amongst ourselves and other folks, we actually decided to rebury the ritual items in this kiva in their original position as we backfilled it. And we felt that that was a step in the right direction for trying to understand how to deal with these ritually charged environments that we encounter as archaeologists. I mean, these are not my spaces. These are other people's places. And they're the objects that were in here. We're doing real work for the Pueblo people of the past and the present. So we felt that might, we've documented everything as well as we could, but we did feel it was important to return those things to where they came from. So the West Greathouse, we're finally arriving at some of the Chacoan era archaeology of the western part of the Haynie site. And we've discovered that the West Greathouse was a lot more complex than initially thought. It's been a real challenge because those of you who've been to the Haynie site know there's like 3 rooms left of the West Greathouse. It's almost entirely gone. It's this big square that I have highlighted on the map right here behind the house and behind the what we call the paint shop. So what I did is I actually turned to some notes and archives that we had received from the prior landowner, from Claudia Haynie, who was part of the excavation effort, the non-professional excavation work done there in the 80s and the 90s. And my hat is off to Claudia for taking pictures, for taking notes, making sketch maps. It has been instrumental in understanding what this Chacoan structure was actually like. Because there's so little of it left for us to see now. Now, most of these maps and images were created in the 1980s, but last winter, myself and my colleague Tim Wilcox, we sat down and just went through every single thing that Claudia had passed on to us of saying, here, take these notes, see what you can do with them. And it was incredibly helpful. For one thing, we realized that the plan map of the West Greathouse we've been working with is somewhat idealized and probably not a totally accurate representation of what the building was. We found a series of maps that dated immediately following the excavation work that they had done in 1985 that really helped us understand that there are major differences between the east and the west half of this structure, that the west half of the structure was perhaps a more minor component of the total floor plan, and that there were differences in the wall construction techniques between these two halves of the structure. Looking through the photos, we also realized that the west half of the structure was a lot taller than the east half. So you can see right here, this very tall rubble mound on the left, the much lower reduced rubble mound on the right. And the paint shop was green back in those days too. It's white now. The photos revealed that the masonry in that east half was a patterned, well-coursed, flaked edge masonry, and that the walls were a single stone width wide. It's actually in some ways, a much finer masonry style than some of the later masonry we've encountered at the site. And it was radically different than what I was expecting to see. I got into this and I went, whoa, that's a lot earlier style of construction than what we're used to seeing in what we thought were some very late Pueblo II Chacoan structures at the Haynie site. And in fact, they compare really favorably to some of the masonry at the Wallace Greathouse, which is literally just across the street from Haynie. Dr. Bruce Bradley and his wife Cindy have been working on that site for nearly 50 years now, and they have encountered this masonry style that they feel fairly confident is early. It dates in the early 1000s, not the later 1000s. And those of you familiar with the Bradley's work there know that the Wallace Greathouse is considered one of the earliest greathouses in Southwest Colorado. Well, based on the work that we've done, I think we can say that at least part of one of the greathouses at the Haynie site may have been contemporaneous with the earliest parts of Wallace. The pottery assemblage also reinforces the fact that there was some really early stuff in the Greathouse, the West Greathouse at Haynie. This photo shows mostly Cortez black on white, 2 different styles of Cortez, an early and a late one. It has some early Mancus black on white. There is a Chaco black on white picture down in the lower right-hand corner that you can see. But for the most part, this assemblage dates somewhere in the 900s and the early 1000s. Most of this is pottery manufactured prior to 1050, which reinforces that there probably was an early component to the Greathouse there. I think that they've also encountered some underlying Pueblo I rooms as well. So using Claudia's notes, we've been able to build a slightly better map of the West Greathouse that is really trying to tease out the different components. We think that this thing might have been positioned on top of a Pueblo I room block. We have found some tantalizing evidence of that late in the season, just a couple of weeks ago. I think that there was an early greathouse structure there, and that it also had a McElmo phase 1100s era greathouse plopped onto it. And we found some evidence of maybe Mesa Verde phase or post-Chacoan construction as well. And that's all just from going through notes and photos. We did realize that they actually mapped out the location of structure 1024 that Steve Copeland and other participants excavated on. That was a fun surprise. But it really got me thinking about early greathouses in the Mesa Verde region. This is one of the bigger implications of some of the work here from this archival project. And there are more. Haynie is not alone. As I said, Wallace Greathouse seems to have an early component. The Mitchell Springs Pueblo I, where Dave Dove has been working for several years, seems to be one of these. I think that a couple of sites up on Mesa Verde might also have these underlying early greathouses that are increasingly being recognized. I mean, they're not common and they don't look that exciting by later standards, but compared to every other kind of house being built in the early 1000s, they are quite exceptional with their masonry and their big oversized rooms. It does raise a question, are these things Chacoan? And how do we gauge, are they a local manifestation or a Chacoan manifestation? It sure makes a research design based around understanding the relationship of the Haynie site to the Chacoan world as a whole more interesting, because suddenly we're going, well, which greathouse are we talking about? The early one or the late one? We're going to have a lot of fun as we start teasing out some of the artifacts here to understand how these early greathouses fit into the bigger picture. Now, the Chaco era deposits, we do have some dates that reflect that period. The fill of a pit structure on the west edge of the site has produced radiocarbon dates that seem to be pretty firmly in the Chacoan period, the 1075 to 1150 zone. And there are two tree ring dates from the West Greathouse that Tom Wines collected, I want to say in about 2008. We don't know exactly where they came from because the beams were just hanging out in the garage, as I understand. They weren't actually taken out of architecture. It was more like the landowner said, oh yeah, those came from that building over there. But 1047 VV, 1083 VV, that means that we don't know how many rings were lost from the outside. Those aren't cutting dates, but the 1083 one at the very least suggests the construction of some of this is happening in the late 1000s or even the early 1100s. So turning to that pit structure that has Chaco era deposits, this is actually really fun and very exciting. It was probably a middle Pueblo II or even earlier masonry lined pit structure, but when it was no longer being inhabited, it was the space was used as a repository for Chaco era debris. So here's a couple of photos just giving you a sense of the fill of that pit structure. And you can't see this now. We had to shore this thing up. This is a very challenging unit to work in, logistically speaking. And so we're working in these tiny little windows between plywood shoring up the deposits. But the artifacts that are coming out of that fill that dates to the Chacoan era, we have had unusual quantities of ladles, ladle handles, and effigies. And foremost among those are what we call burden basket effigies. And here are a few examples from the Haynie site. These are tiny, I mean, these things are very small. These are tiny little kind of representations of a basketry style that becomes common during the Chacoan era. And these little effigies often occur as the end of ladle handles. So I think that's why we've got this concurrence of ladles, ladle parts, plus these little effigies. They break off fairly easily, but I have an example of one here that does in fact have the burden basket effigy intact. The effigies themselves are actually fairly common in Southwest Colorado. I think there's this, at this point with this work we've done at the Haynie site, there's probably as many of these little effigies showing up from Southwest Colorado as have been found in all of Chaco Canyon. And that's, Pueblo Bonito and everything that's been excavated in such huge numbers. So they really do seem to be a Southwest Colorado way of referencing a basketry style that is more common in other parts of the Chacoan world. The other interesting thing about this ladle handle is the design motif on it. It's what we call a flagstaff or Sanawa style decoration. For the pottery nerds out there, we designate that by the design symmetry. It's a very complex kind of design symmetry that is well known from northeastern Arizona and north central Arizona, but after having a conversation with Ben Bellarado today, he straightened me out that the style very well might develop in Chaco in the mid 1000s and becomes kind of one marker of Chacoan knowledge and a Chacoan way of doing things. And so while the ladle handle that we have in front of us here, we looked at the temper and we're like, yeah, this was probably made in Southwest Colorado. The person who made it was familiar with the kind of design elements, symmetries, and motifs that were common on these very complicated baskets and pottery that are coming out of Chaco Canyon itself. Now, I want to turn to the larger landscape a little bit. So the Haynie site is, it gives us, the Conservancy property gives us this great window, this detailed, in-depth look at one part of this much larger landscape that is what we call the Lakeview community. And that includes the Ida Jean Greathouse and the Wallace Greathouse. The Wallace Greathouse is to the south, just across the street. The Ida Jean Greathouse is privately owned, and it is somewhat west of the Haynie site. And this map kind of gives you a sense of that's about 1.5 miles across. And we have been slowly working with landowners and going through the site records, trying to figure out the community that surrounds these great houses. I think for a while there was a perception that there wasn't much of a community to go with them. I think that the real distinction here is that 150 odd years of Euro-American settlement has managed to erase a lot of the Pueblo archaeology, the Pueblo presence that was on this place for over nearly 1,000 years. So we're trying to tease that out. It's a long process. One thing that we've noticed as we stood back and took a big, broad look at things, the Haynie site and the Lakeview community in general, you can see the little tiny red dots down in the kind of lower left corner here. Those are the Greathouses. They are positioned at a critical choke point in the watershed. All of that area that you see on your map drains into Simon Draw, which flows right past the Haynie site. It's positioned right in a bend of that drainage. And my colleague Jeremy Grunvig really helped us figure this out. Tim Wilcox and I were walking around the landscape by Haynie, and we went, I don't think that the drainage is, I don't think it's where it used to be. And through running some GIS models, we discovered that in fact, the most likely path for the drainage prior to 20th century agriculture would have taken it in a bend that went right past the Haynie site, between the Haynie site and the Wallace Greathouse. This watershed is critical for understanding how the community was structured in terms of agriculture. This is a place where you probably could have farmed using runoff farming diverted out of this water course at particular times of the year. And that's one big question that we want to start addressing is how does that work? What are the dynamics of that kind of agriculture? It's very different than the direct precipitation farming that Crow Canyon has studied for many years. So this is an interesting shift that I really look forward to being able to have conversations with some of our Pueblo colleagues who have helped so much with, say, the Pueblo Farming Project. I want to start to understand how is the differences between dry farming and this runoff farming affecting different kinds of greathouse communities in Southwest Colorado. Looking kind of conceptually at the larger landscape, as I said, Simon Draw originally would have gone between Wallace and the Haynie site. That's a big difference. We also noticed that there's these conical hills that surround parts of the community. Those of you who've been with me out at the site, I usually point out that when you're standing atop the East Greathouse at Haynie, you can see these 3 low hills in the near horizon. There is a less visible small hill to the west that's somewhat south of the Ida Jean Greathouse. Now, these are places that from conversations with Pueblo people and through looking at Pueblo ethnography, these would probably have been very meaningful spots within the Pueblo landscape surrounding the village at Haynie, at Wallace, and at Ida Jean, kind of forming the middle boundary between the center of the village and the outside world as a whole. In addition, there is an alignment with the Farview community. If you draw a line roughly north-south between the Haynie site, Wallace, and these conical hills, you're going to end up at the Farview community on Mesa Verde, which is about 10 miles away. So we don't think that's entirely a coincidence. That's something that needs to be investigated to go, is it chance, is it not chance? But it does seem to be a critical aspect of how this community was laid out at the landscape level. And we're starting to get the very inklings of how this landscape changed through time, which is a particular interest of mine. Prior to the Chacoan period, recall now, we would have had these 2 early greathouses, one at Wallace and a portion, probably one at Haynie as well. The Itagene Greathouse didn't exist yet, and the Haynie East Greathouse probably didn't exist yet either. Those were constructed most likely after 1100. So you would have had this dual Greathouse, one down low at the Wallace site, and maybe it's not coincidental that the Wallace Greathouse is probably well, it is multi-story. It's at least 2 and probably 3 stories tall if you talk to Bruce. The one at Haynie might have only been a single story tall. That does get me to start thinking about weird coincidences with Pueblo Bonito and Pueblo Alto and Chaco Canyon. But this landscape with the symmetrically positioned early greathouses, it changes as we move into the Chacoan period. Wallace, the old part of that structure is sort of encapsulated in the later building that dates somewhere in the late 1000s, early 1100s. At Haynie, a whole new greathouse is constructed. A structure is added on top of that old greathouse that I talked about earlier. The Itagene site goes in, and looking through the records, the site records that date from the 1980s when some surveys were done, there's a possibility that there's a blocked in kiva, which is a particular kind of a Chacoan approach to building kivas, where you make them above ground and you kind of surround them with some masonry. The site form sure makes it sound like there might be something like that over there. And this is one of those places where working with landowners is really critical. We would love to get access to that spot and take a look at it and say, is this really, is this an unusual kiva that might be part of this Chaco period landscape? If it is, it sure looks like through time, this place is becoming a very Chaco-esque landscape. And here I've got a slide just showing sort of, here's the Aztec complex down at Aztec ruins, and here is downtown Chaco. There's a lot of cardinality to Chacoan landscapes, these axes that go east-west, north-south. And when you start looking at the Haynie, at Lakeview through time, especially with all that we're learning about the Haynie site, it starts to look like the landscape is being pushed towards this Chacoan model, this cardinal model. So in conclusion, the testing that Crow Canyon has done over the past few years has revealed a lot about the Haynie site. I think it has shown us the complexity of the archaeology that is there. It is giving us a very good idea of what future management of the site might want to consider. What are the kinds of things that might be encountered in future excavations? Where are places where we might want to not excavate? Questions like that. It's demonstrated that the site was nearly continually inhabited from around at least 780, those are our earliest dates, up until about 1220. And that's the best range I can give right now, subject to change after we get some more ceramics and other dates back. But that's really remarkable to me as I stand on that place today, and I think about my presence on the site. As you know, I've been here for 2.5 years. A lot of the Euro-American ranchers who've been working and living in this valley, they've been here maybe 140 at this point. That's an almost 500-year span of Pueblo people living on the landscape around Haynie. That's very deep connection, very deep knowledge. We're learning that the Chacoan connections are most evident at the scale of the whole Lakeview community. It's been really fun teasing this out and seeing the ways in which some of the items associated with structure 1047 are indicative of people interacting with ideas that would have been common in the Chacoan world in the 1000s. I'm very excited seeing how this landscape slowly is morphing into that as well. You really have to investigate that at a variety of scales. And I think that's what we're beginning to learn from Haynie. Landscape level research is only possible through landowner outreach, though. I mean, in the first place, we wouldn't be here without the hard work of folks like Jim and the Archaeological Conservancy and folks here at Crow Canyon who have been keeping an eye on places that need to be protected, that need to be understood better and need to be set aside for future generations. It's really critical working with people out in the community there. And then finally, I'm thinking back about this and going, we need more Native American engagement. That's a whole side of this story that I have not talked about very much tonight. And I think for future work that might be done at the Haynie site, it's something that we do need to consider is how do we bring Native American consultants in much earlier in the process so that we can think about research questions that are of importance to them. So I think I've run a little bit over my time. I apologize. I hope it was interesting and engaging. I want to say thank you to a variety of folks, the Conservancy, of course, for making all this happen and for inviting me to come and talk about the work that Crow Canyon's doing. The National Science Foundation has provided funding for our field schools. The State Historical Fund of Colorado has funded a lot of the research that's occurred out here and did make the purchase of the property possible. My colleagues here at Crow Canyon, this is not just a one-man show. I get up in front of the camera, but there are a dozen people behind the scenes making all of this happen, 24 people behind the scenes making all of this happen. The National Endowment for the Humanities has provided support for some of our outreach efforts. And I also have to say thank you to all of the donors who have helped fund the Archaeological Conservancy, to all of the donors who have helped fund Crow Canyon, and the students and participants who've worked alongside myself and other people here at Crow Canyon. Without you, this work would not be possible. So thank you very much. I think I'm going to end my screen share now. And as I understand it, we will be doing a little bit of some Q&A. Let me end this and that, stop my share. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Kellam. That was awesome. Jim, thank you. It looks like we have several questions. And thank you, Dr. Susan Ryan, for being on chat and answering some of the questions in real time for us. That was very nice. She's hanging out in the audience there, so she captured some of the questions. That was great.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah. Let's see here. I'm going to kind of go down a list as they came in, and we'll get to as many as we can. Okay. Let's see here. Lots of people ask questions about permanent residency at Haynie. Was there like a permanent residency? Were there times of when they were occupied, or it was completely abandoned, things like that?
My understanding of the site, and I mean, we'll have to bring Jim in too, because we can include the historic and recent period as well. The occupancy of the Haynie site has been ongoing for a long time. My understanding archaeologically is that beginning in the middle or late 700s, people lived at the Haynie site until the late 800s. Regionally, there tends to be a hiatus in late Pueblo I sites. And so there's a little inside baseball. This is real archaeology stuff. So might be some folks out there this is pertinent to. We have not yet identified that gap between like 890 and 930. I'm not sure if there are people living at the Haynie site in that period, but there certainly are people there by the middle 900s. And I think it's almost unabated inhabitation up until probably, my guess is the later 1100s, at which point it might switch to more temporary use, people coming back for ritual purposes. But to be honest, I have not spent as much time thinking about the late end of this sequence as the early end. And I do know that there are many features in the East Greathouse based on the work that Susan Ryan's done that probably do date from the late 11s and maybe the early 1200s. Following that, it probably did lie depopulated for some time. I mean, it probably didn't fall out of the memory of the Pueblo people who had been there. We have not found any evidence of protohistoric Ute or Navajo occupation on the site, but that usually is very subtle. I think it would be hard to see beneath the large veneer of historic use. We've got some historic features and artifacts that probably go back to the late 19th century. We have a lot of evidence of people pot hunting out there throughout the middle 20th century. And I think we've also got evidence going back into we've got a few units where I'm going, I think we're in a pothole that dates from, 1910 or something like that. And then of course, people have been living on the site since the 1960s, which is where Jim can probably talk a bit about people living there. If you want to.
I really didn't see it until 1982. And so I don't know much about who lived there in the 1960s, but.
It went through a variety of owners. That's actually been one of the really fun parts of the archival work, is that through figuring out who lived at the Haynie site throughout the 20th century, we've identified collections that are in repositories in Southwest Colorado that came from the Haynie site that we did not know about, that people excavated in the 1940s and 50s. Well, I hope that answers that question. Probably more detail than anybody wanted.
Well, there was also a question regarding kind of if you could differentiate, or what kind of differences between Pueblo I and II technology and artifacts did you find? Like, are there? I guess the question was, what is the difference? Are there differences? Are they subtle? Are they,
That's a good question. The differences, to me, the differences are relatively subtle. Architecturally, there are major changes in construction technique, though. We have seen a shift away from adobe construction. We do have a couple adobe rooms and post and adobe rooms that date to the Pueblo I period. I don't know of any yet that date to the earlier middle Pueblo II. People seem to have shifted their masonry from using chunked up bits of sandstone that we think are being quarried practically on the site. Just like you drive over the quarry on your way into the site is what we're beginning to think. They shift to using water rounded cobbles for many of the walls, incorporated into a lot of clay and mud. And so it's a little tough to draw the line between, is it adobe with a stone core, or is it masonry with like half the volume of the wall is actually made up of clay and adobe. In terms of the artifacts, some of the things that we see changing, there are a large increase in decorated serving vessels. I don't know if that's a technological change per se, but it does suggest that there's big differences in how people are using ceramics and pottery. They're decorating a lot more of it in the Pueblo I period, probably 3 times as much is what I've seen looking at ceramics tallies. So those are a couple of things that I could mention.
Okay, I've seen several questions regarding water sources and kind of like why this Pueblo is where it's at. You know, what makes this place desirable for people to live, I guess. But there have been lots of questions about irrigation and water sources near this Pueblo. There
are springs that seem to flow year-round, not far from the site, just off to the west. There is a very damp area that may be the remnants of a spring immediately south of the site. So there is probably water. It's sometimes tricky to figure hydrology out because irrigation water today augments the water table in ways that it would not have in the past. And they do irrigate the fields that surround the Haynie site now. So it's hard to get a bead on some of those springs. One of the things we're trying to learn with the modeling, the GIS modeling, would be, is that drainage in a irrigated agricultural setting, is that drainage perennial? Is there any chance that springs upstream were recharging that water table enough that that thing flowed year round? I think it's an open question. Today it runs almost all year round. Undoubtedly, the Haynie site is positioned where it is because it is at this juncture between the uplands to the north and the northeast of us, where you can get pinyon pine and juniper and ponderosa, and the lowlands where there is greasewood and sagebrush, and it's farmable land. It's positioned right in the middle there, and that does seem to be a place where water occurs a lot. And it's also at a spot along that drainage where, if you wanted to, you probably can divert water from the stream. So you can find water practically everywhere in Southwest Colorado if you know where to look. I know it seems arid, but it's surprisingly, it's not as challenging as you might think. Haynie seems to be well positioned for a very particular kind of agriculture and living that typified the late Pueblo I period. And it's like a lot of other, its setting is very similar to other P1 villages that I've seen.
Okay, someone asked if you all have found structures or anything archaeologically significant kind of spilling over across property lines from Haynie Pueblo. And if so, how archaeologically significant are they?
I feel like that's somebody who knows a little bit about the property. In fact, the East Greathouse is split by a property line. When you are standing atop it and looking down into one of the more famous kivas, you're looking onto a different property. I suspect the scale of the Pueblo I occupation out there, if it really was a Pueblo I village, most of the village is probably beyond the property line, would be my guess. And the few little windows I've had into other land around us suggest that's true. That's one of the real challenges with working in a place that has been homesteaded and farmed and lived in a sort of capitalist agricultural milieu, is that the landscape gets segmented through time in ways that make it very hard to understand how it may have been experienced by people in the past. And I think it probably makes it hard for say Pueblo people to experience it in the present in the way that they may have wanted to understand it. It's hard to get to these places. and to experience them how they would have been because of that property issue. So yes, there is parts of the Haynie site that continue beyond the property line.
Jim, at any time, if you have something to say, pipe in, it's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see here. Someone did ask, why did people move south or east and not north?
At the end of the Pueblo I period. My guess would be is if you go north from here, it gets a lot harder to farm. We're at the edge of, there's this farm belt that sort of stretches in a big band from southeast Utah towards the La Plata Mountains and the highlands near Telluride. Going north, you would run into places where maize agriculture would become somewhat difficult because of the growing season. That is an interesting question though, and one that it would be unusual for there to be an agricultural society that did not have people who were more mobile hunter-gatherers living on the peripheries of those agricultural communities. Cross-culturally around the world, that's almost always the case. And so I do wonder, who is up there in the area like Norwood, who's up there near Telluride during this period? And it's possible that Pueblo people in the Pueblo I period may have switched their material culture signature very dramatically, and we just don't see them when they went there as archaeologists.
Okay, I'm going to make this our final question because I know we're way over. And it's kind of for both of us. Someone asked, how are Crow Canyon and the Archaeological Conservancy balancing conservation and research? How much more excavation is planned for Haynie?
Hey, thank you, Michael. I see that was your question, and that's a good one. And it puts me in the hot seat in some good ways. What we are looking at now, and Jim, I hope this isn't like totally new knowledge for you. I think we can finish what we have started in 2 more seasons. We've got a responsibility to many of the excavation units that have been started. And I think that we can finish that within a couple of seasons, and we've got a plan in place for that. The way that happens, though, is through dialogue with the Conservancy of what comes next. And it's saying, here's where we've accomplished. This was the original research design. We've learned an awful lot. Where do we want to go from here? And as I said, I think that's a conversation that can bring in a variety of stakeholders to say, what do we want to do? There's a lot of players involved here, and I can't speak for everybody. So Jim, I'll turn it over to you as well.
Well, this is not the first archaeological site that is owned by the Conservancy that Crow Canyon has worked on. And Crow Canyon has done quite a bit of work at the Yellow Jacket site, the Albert Porter site, this site, and Headley Pueblo in Utah. And one of the things that we really appreciate about Crow Canyon is that they have a philosophy that has really revolutionized archaeology and the way Southwestern archaeologists look at approaching a site. And that is that they try to move a minimum amount of work, a minimum amount of dirt, basically, and extract from that a maximum amount of information. And it's worked out very well for both of us, because obviously the Conservancy is dedicated to the concept of conservation archaeology, which means that a major portion of every archaeological site should be left intact and undisturbed for the future, because archaeology is a changing science. We're always coming up with new ideas and new techniques. The only way that you can excavate an archaeological site is, and find new answers, is to do it on a site that hasn't been completely excavated. In the past, archaeologists dug every room because they didn't want to miss anything. And you can point to a number of sites in the Southwest where that has happened. Tuzigood is a really good one. Tuzigood is a southern Sonawa site in the Verde Valley, 110 rooms, and I believe they excavated something like 105 of them in the 1930s. So they didn't want to miss anything. Well, that was certainly the wrong way to do it because our knowledge of Tuzigoot is locked into the archaeological technology of the 1930s. So when Crow Canyon finishes a project, you realize when you go back and look at all the units they've put in and all the decisions they've made about where to dig, that they have made little peeks into various aspects of the site. And this is really good for them because they're responsible for paying for the curation for whatever they take out of the ground. And so by minimizing their impact on the site, they're doing archaeology a favor by not bringing back that many artifacts to the lab, which they then have to pay to curate. They're doing their own organization a favor. And so I think that their model of taking sneak peeks at sites, maximizing the amount of information, minimizing the amount of dirt they're moving, all archaeologists in the Southwest should really look at this very carefully because it's a model for the future. So I think that we have worked very well with Crow Canyon in the past. We're looking forward to working with them on other sites in the future. And they certainly are following conservation archaeology to the letter.
Well, thank you, Jim.
Well,
So if that
Jim.
was the last question, I would like to just say, Kellam, great job. An amazing report on Haynie Pueblo. And I think you're really doing very well with what you're doing out there. We, again, appreciate everyone for sitting through the lecture and learning more about Haynie Pueblo. And I just want to thank all of the supporters who've helped us because without it, we wouldn't be here tonight. So thank you very much for attending and thank you for your continued support.
Thank you, everybody. And we'll be back in 2022 with a new lecture series. So stay tuned and watch our website. Have a happy holiday season and a very, very happy and safe New Year's. And we'll see you next year.
Thanks.
Take care, y'all.